The ghosts of Jeju Island, where the dead never left. Jeju Island is one of South Korea's most beautiful destinations. Surrounded by deep blue ocean and covered with volcanic mountains, forests, stone villages, and mysterious caves, the island attracts millions of visitors every year. During the day, Jeju can feel peaceful and almost dreamlike. But after sunset, some parts of the island take on a completely different atmosphere. Beneath its natural beauty lies one of the darkest chapters in modern Korean history, the tragedy known as the Jeju April 3 incident, or Jeju 4.3. Between 1948 and 1949, violence spread across the island, villages were destroyed, families were separated, and thousands of people lost their lives. Many people fled into the mountains and volcanic caves to hide. Some never returned. Decades later, memorials and historical sites preserve the memory of those who died, while local stories continue to describe strange encounters in forests, caves, and lonely roads. Whether these stories are supernatural or simply the product of fear and memory, one thing is certain: Jeju is an island that remembers. Daniel had heard stories about Jeju long before he ever visited the island. He was a documentary photographer from Seoul who specialized in abandoned places and forgotten historical sites. When he arrived in Jeju, however, he wasn't searching for ghosts. He wanted to photograph the island's forests, volcanic landscapes, and old villages. During the day, everything seemed peaceful. He photographed black volcanic rocks along the coastline, narrow stone walls surrounding fields, and ancient trees whose branches moved slowly in the ocean wind. But when night came, the island seemed to change. The mountains disappeared into darkness, the roads became almost completely empty, and the sound of the wind moving through the trees sometimes sounded strangely like distant voices. One evening, Daniel stopped at a small restaurant in a quiet rural village. The owner was an elderly man named Mr. Han. While Daniel was looking through photographs on his camera, Mr. Han noticed a picture showing a narrow road disappearing into a forest. The old man's expression immediately changed. He asked Daniel where he had taken the photograph. Daniel pointed toward the mountains and explained that he had found the road while exploring earlier that day. Mr. Han remained silent for several seconds before telling him not to go there after dark. Daniel smiled and asked why. The old man simply replied, "Some roads remember." Daniel laughed nervously because he assumed it was nothing more than an old local superstition. But before Daniel left the restaurant, Mr. Han gave him one final warning. If he ever heard someone calling his name while he was inside the forest, he should not answer. The warning stayed in Daniel's mind. Later that night, instead of going to sleep, he began researching Jeju's history. What he discovered was far more disturbing than the ghost stories he had heard. The Jeju April 3 incident began during a period of enormous political tension following Korea's liberation from Japanese colonial rule and the division of the Korean peninsula. Violence spread throughout the island, and civilians became trapped between armed groups, police, and military forces. Many people escaped into the mountains to hide. Some sheltered inside volcanic caves. Entire villages were destroyed, and thousands of civilians were killed. For decades, many families were afraid to speak openly about what had happened. Names were remembered quietly, stories were passed from grandparents to grandchildren, and some places became permanently associated with tragedy. The next evening, Daniel returned to the forest. He told himself that he was only going there to photograph the landscape. He parked his rental car beside the road and walked toward the trees. The sun had already disappeared behind the mountains, and the forest was becoming darker with every step. His flashlight illuminated the narrow path in front of him. Eventually, he reached the entrance of an old volcanic cave. The opening was surrounded by dark rocks and twisted roots. Daniel raised his camera and took a photograph. The camera worked normally. He took another picture, but this time the screen displayed an error. He tried again. Another error appeared. Thinking that his memory card was damaged, Daniel checked it and discovered that the rest of his photographs were completely fine. He raised the camera again and took another picture of the cave. This time the photograph appeared on the screen. Daniel looked at it casually at first, but then his expression changed. Deep inside the cave, something appeared to be standing in the darkness. It looked like a woman. She seemed to be wearing an old-fashioned white dress, and her long dark hair covered most of her back. Daniel immediately turned around, expecting to see someone standing behind him. There was nobody there. He slowly looked back at the camera. The woman was still visible in the photograph. Daniel zoomed in, but the image became distorted. He couldn't see her face clearly. Nervously, he deleted the photograph. Then he heard a voice behind him. "Daniel." He froze. The voice was quiet, almost like a whisper carried by the wind. Daniel slowly turned around. His flashlight moved across the trees, but there was nobody there. He remembered Mr. Han's warning. "Don't answer." Daniel said nothing. Then the voice came again, this time much closer. "Daniel." He grabbed his camera and ran. Daniel didn't stop until he reached his car. He quickly opened the door, climbed inside, locked it, and sat there trying to control his breathing. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then there was a soft sound against the driver's window. Tap. Daniel looked toward the glass. Nothing. Then another sound came. Tap. He turned toward the passenger window and suddenly saw a woman standing beside the car. She wore a long white dress, and her face looked unnaturally pale beneath the moonlight. She didn't move. She simply stared toward the vehicle. Daniel couldn't take his eyes off her. Slowly, she raised one hand and pointed toward the forest. Daniel blinked. The woman was gone. There was no movement outside the car. No footsteps. No figure disappearing into the trees. She was simply no longer there. Daniel started the engine and drove away without looking back. The following morning, Daniel returned to Mr. Han's restaurant. He described what had happened. When he mentioned the woman in white, the old man became unusually quiet. After several seconds, he whispered a word Daniel had heard before in Korean folklore, Cheonyo-gwizan. The term refers to the spirit of a young unmarried woman who died before fulfilling traditional expectations surrounding marriage and family. In Korean folklore, such spirits are often portrayed wearing white clothing and having long dark hair. But Mr. Han quickly warned Daniel not to assume that every ghost story was the same. "People died here in many different ways," he said. Daniel asked whether Mr. Han had ever seen something himself. The old man looked toward the window and remained silent. Finally, he told Daniel that his grandfather had disappeared during the violence of Jeju 4.3. He had gone into the mountains and never returned. His family never learned exactly what happened to him. That afternoon, Daniel visited a memorial dedicated to the victims of Jeju 4.3. He walked slowly past the names engraved and preserved in memory. Hundreds of names represented lives that had ended decades earlier. Daniel photographed several sections of the memorial. Then he suddenly noticed a surname that caught his attention. It was the same surname Mr. Han had mentioned. Daniel took a photograph of the name and returned to the restaurant that evening. When he showed Mr. Han the image, the elderly man's face became pale. He touched the screen with trembling fingers. "That's my grandfather," he whispered. Daniel asked how he could be certain. Mr. Han answered, "Because I've been looking for his name my entire life." That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He opened the photographs from his camera and began reviewing them one by one. Most of them were ordinary pictures of forests, rocks, roads, and caves. Then he found something strange. There was a photograph of the forest road that he didn't remember taking. The image showed several people standing far away between the trees. Daniel counted them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They were standing completely still and facing the camera. He checked the photograph's timestamp. 2:13 a.m. Daniel stared at the screen. He had been asleep at 2:13. He checked the location data. The photograph had been taken deep inside the forest. Daniel couldn't remember ever being there at that time. The following evening, he returned to the forest with an audio recorder. This time, he wanted evidence. He told himself that if something strange happened again, he would record it. He walked down the same road and switched on the recorder. His voice sounded unusually loud in the silence. Jeju Island. 11:47 p.m. He continued walking. A few minutes later, he heard footsteps behind him. Step. Daniel stopped. Silence. He started walking again. Step. Another footstep. This time it sounded closer. Daniel turned around and pointed his flashlight down the road. Nothing. He continued forward. Step. Step. The footsteps continued behind him. Then a woman's voice whispered through the darkness. Why did you leave us? Daniel stopped breathing. Another voice answered from somewhere deeper in the forest. We waited. Then another voice repeated the words. We waited. And another. We waited. Suddenly, Daniel felt surrounded by whispers. He couldn't tell where they were coming from. They seemed to move through the trees from every direction. He dropped the recorder and ran toward the road. Then one final voice spoke. It said his name. Daniel. He remembered Mr. Han's warning. Don't answer. He kept running. When Daniel finally reached the edge of the forest, he saw the woman again. She was standing beside the road, wearing the same white dress. Her long hair moved slightly in the wind. This time she wasn't pointing toward the forest. Instead, she pointed directly at Daniel's camera. Daniel looked down. The camera screen had switched on by itself. A photograph appeared. It showed the cave. But now the woman was standing inside it. And behind her were dozens of other figures. Men. Women. Children. All of them were looking directly toward the camera. Daniel looked up. The woman had disappeared. Several days later, Daniel returned to Seoul. He never went back to that forest. But he kept the photographs and the recording. He eventually examined the audio again using professional equipment. Most of the recording contained nothing unusual. There was wind, Daniel's footsteps, and his breathing. But near the end, hidden beneath the background noise, was a faint voice. Daniel increased the volume. The voice became clearer. It wasn't saying his name. It was saying another name. The name belonged to the same person whose name Daniel had photographed at the memorial. Mr. Han's grandfather. Daniel contacted the old man and played the recording for him. Mr. Han listened without speaking. When the recording ended, there was a long silence. Finally, Mr. Han said, "That's his voice." Daniel asked how he could possibly know. The old man answered quietly, "Because I heard it when I was a child." Daniel asked what the voice had said. Mr. Han looked down. He told us to run. Years passed, but Daniel never forgot Jeju. He kept the photographs on an old hard drive and refused to publish them. There was one photograph in particular that continued to disturb him. It showed the forest road at night. At first glance, there was nothing unusual. But when Daniel increased the brightness, he could see figures standing between the trees. Not one or two. Dozens of them. And at the center of the image stood the woman in white. Her face was turned toward the camera. Daniel eventually noticed something he had never seen before. Behind the woman was a stone wall. Written across the wall was a single name. Daniel's name. To this day, Daniel refuses to explain what happened in that forest. Perhaps the photographs were corrupted. Perhaps exhaustion and fear caused him to misinterpret ordinary shadows. Perhaps the voices were nothing more than wind passing through the volcanic landscape. There are rational explanations for many strange experiences. But there is something that no explanation can erase. The graves remain. The memorials remain. The caves remain. And the names remain. Jeju Island is still beautiful. Tourists still walk along its beaches. Families still explore its forests. Travelers still photograph its volcanic mountains and watch the sunset over the sea. Most people who visit the island will never experience anything frightening. But there are places where history feels unusually close. Places where silence seems heavier. Places where the past refuses to disappear. And perhaps, on a quiet night when the road is empty and the forest wind suddenly stops, you might hear a voice beneath the trees. Not a scream. Not a monster. Just a whisper. Calling a name. A name belonging to someone who has been gone for decades. And if that voice ever calls your name, remember the warning given by an old man in a small restaurant on Jeju Island. Don't answer. Because some places don't want visitors. They want witnesses. And on Jeju Island, the dead may not be waiting to hurt you. They may simply be waiting for someone to remember them.